Hi, this is Roger. Thanks for dropping by. Sunday morning chat. And today I'd really like to touch on, I often get asked what are some easy orchids to grow? And my simple answer is all of them. There's no difficult orchids, but what there is are orchids that are very intolerant of being outside their comfort zone. And therein lies the problem. It's not the orchids, it's that comfort zone. And some of them, that comfort zone is a very, very narrow space. And too far out of that comfort zone and the orchid will suffer. That's what makes it difficult. Yeah, it's not the orchid itself. I suppose you could say that probably the most tolerant orchid of adverse conditions is the good old complex hybrid Phalaenopsis, because they've been bred to be like that. And they are special and an exception to the rule. So they're in a class of their own. The way they've been hybridized and the way they've been produced and everything like that, they are tolerant of adverse conditions. Yeah? Lower light levels than they really want, they'll put up with it. Yeah, higher light levels than they really want, they'll put up with it. If you go too far, you'll burn them. But you know, they're pretty tolerant on light levels. They're pretty tolerant on a bit of neglect as well. You know, I mean, if you forget to water them for a couple of days, they're not going to die. They'll probably be okay. But those are the exception. Because they've been bred that way, and they are the only orchids that have had that done to them, quite honestly. You know, many years ago it was deemed, you know, that the Phalaenopsis orchid, because of its basic tolerance levels before they got at the hybridization the way it is now, was a good one to mass produce and use the meristem cloning process, mash up a bit and produce thousands and thousands of plants. So they lend themselves very easy to mass production, and therein lies the market saturation of that type of orchid, because it's profitable. It's as simple as that. And the big mass producers, Germany and the Netherlands, I mean, I only know about those sort of people in the EU. You know, they've got it off to a fine art now. It really is a fine art. I mean, those plants are hardly ever touched by human hand. I think the only thing left that's done by humans is that last little bit of packing where they're put in that clear sleeve. Yeah, ready to be shipped out, basically. I mean, their bloom spikes are always staked upright. They've got to go in that sleeve at the end of the day, and if that means bending a leaf to get them in there, they will. But what you have to appreciate is what happens after they leave the mass producers. And they get to market, basically, and they're bid on by the next level in the chain. So that will be the supermarket buyers, garden centre buyers, where there's chain market garden centres and things like that. And they'll bid on them in their thousands. And they don't want to pay too much money. Yeah? But what isn't appreciated is that those orchids that have left the mass producers, once they get to the market, they're actually graded. You know, so there's like, I don't know whether they're done by a numerical grade or an alphabetical grade, but it makes no difference. There are like grade 1 or A class Phalaenopsis hybrids, and they're symmetrically good. All the leaves are brilliant, and they've got the required number of blooms on the required number of flower spikes, all in good condition, probably with a set number of buds still to open. And that will be your grade A stuff, or grade 1, whichever way. I think it's ABC and that sort of stuff. The next ones down are the ones that have probably opened a few more blooms. And that's all that's different about them. Or they might have a little mark on one leaf or something like that. Or one leaf might be a bit smaller than it should be. But they're graded, yeah? And When you get into the cheapo supermarket chains, the plants you get in there are not going to have started out as grade A, probably not even grade B, yeah, because they don't want to pay the price for them. So they're pre-graded at point of sale basically, and then by the time you get them, they probably had even more abuse thrown around, put on a supermarket shelf, and somebody might decide to water them now and again, probably with no skill whatsoever. So they probably either give them a dribble, which is not enough, or drown the poor things and leave them standing in water and stuff like that. So, you know, the art of getting a good one is you. It's you picking out from the selection there. Firstly, do you like the blooms? Because if you don't, why are you buying it? It might be the best plant there, but if you don't particularly like those blooms, every time it does it, you're going to think, oh, I wish I'd got that other one. You know, so you've got to get something you like. You know, that's a prerequisite to selecting. But take the Phalaenopsis out of the scenario, and what else can you get? Well, Cattleyas, they are quite tolerant of a little bit of abuse. If they don't get enough light, they're probably not going to bloom. But again, you know, you're getting them out of their comfort zone. They don't grow in the dark, you know. If you keep Cattleyas soggy, you'll probably lose some roots. Once you lose some roots, you haven't got a healthy plant. And that's, you know, across all the orchids, an unhealthy plant is always going to be more difficult than a healthy one with a good root system. The best way to think of an orchid is from the bottom up, not the top down. And if you can get that round, you get your head round that concept. And what I mean by from the bottom up is this a good root system for the size of the plant? Has it got actively growing roots? Can I even see the flipping roots? Which in a lot of the mass-produced stuff you can't, because they're not in a clear pot. But from the roots up, a good root system in a suitable medium that's not breaking down is the good start point. And from there, you can move up and start looking at the plant. Has it got any new growths? Are there any new growths that look like they're failing? In which case, put it back on the shelf. Unless you're seriously into rescue plants, then find the good one. I mean, I've picked plants before because, you know, irrespective of the blooms, this was the only one with 2 new growths. All the others only had 1 or none. So that was the plant for me. Yeah? Because the potential for blooms has just doubled by having 2 new growths. So you move up into the plant. Does everything look healthy and firm? No soggy bits, no signs of any rot or anything like that. And eventually you get up to the leaves, and again, you know, nice bright leaves, preferably without spotting unless it's a natural trait. Although, you know, that's not the end of the world. A lot of orchids eventually lose their leaves anyway, so one bad leaf doesn't constitute a bad plant. It may just be the oldest leaf and it's its time to drop off. No? But, you know, look at the leaves, have a good look round and get a feel for the plant. And then obviously you move on up, if there are any, to the blooms. And for me, the most important thing is, do I like these blooms? Yeah? And that is important. You know, if the plant's looked after, it could last you years and years. I mean, I've been asked, how long can orchids live for? And the answer is probably forever. Unless something goes wrong and takes the plant down. But under normal circumstances, orchids rejuvenate themselves. Older parts die off, new parts spread along the branch or up the tree trunk or across the ground in that type of thing, and create new parts to the plant and new root systems for those parts and new shoots, canes, whatever you want to call them, leaves if it's a monopodial type. So they're capable of rejuvenating themselves, far less so with the monopodials obviously, because they've only got a single stem. And they just grow upwards, they just keep producing new leaves. And occasionally the older leaves will drop off and you can end up, I mean, I've seen a Phalaenopsis that's a foot long. It was something like 40 years old and it had this big long stem hanging over the side of the pot with nothing on it. There were no roots growing out of it. All the roots were in the pot, and it was a good root system. But there was probably 20 or 30 leaves that had died off on that plant. And on the end of it, hanging over the side, was a lovely looking Phalaenopsis plant. But it looked awful on that big bare stem. But you know, that's like an ultimate plant. You know, you would have to have one a hell of a long time for it to look like that. But yeah, it was unusual. It was brought into the Orchid Society for people to look at. You know, this is how long they can last and what happens to them if you keep them too long. Now, that particular plant for that person was very special. It was the first one they ever had, and they'd still got it. That's pretty good. We all lose a plant or two along the way, and as the years go on, those numbers should just go down as you just get better at, you know, looking after your plants. But anyway, back to types. So we've done the Phalaenopsis, put that out of the way. Had a look at the Cattleya types. The thing with the Cattleya types is to try and do a bit of work beforehand, but most of the time you'll probably buy your first one on a spur of the moment, because in the place where all the Phalaenopsis are, there'll be one Cattleya. Somebody's gone out on a limb and thought, oh, let's see if we can sell that, and just stuck one in there. So there wouldn't be a choice. Well, there is, take it or leave it. But there are some lovely miniature Cattleyas if you're short on space. There are some giants. You know, I mean, it's this is Laelia purpurata something or other. The big and the small. Yeah, Cattleya cernua and a Laelia purpurata. And there are bigger Cattleyas than that. I mean, those pseudobulbs and leaves combined are about probably 20 inches. And on there you've got leaves that are 1 inch long and pseudobulbs that are ½ an inch long. Yeah, so, you know, the big and the small. But if you do a bit of work beforehand and think, well, actually, in the space I've got, I quite like the idea of the small Cattleyas. I mean, you'll get reduced bloom size. You're not going to get a bloom 6 inches across on a miniature Cattleya. So you have to accept that. You know, that it's proportional, effectively. Although there are some miniatures that have quite large blooms for the size of the plant. You see what I mean? Anyway, other types. In the Dendrobium range, which is vast, one of the largest genus, and there are some that you'd have to say are not advisable unless you really can accommodate the conditions they want. There's some Dendrobiums without those conditions will grow into nice plants, but you may never see any blooms. You know, the winter resting types spring to mind. They do need special conditions, and if you can't do that, you're either going to get very few or no blooms at all. So they're special. The Dendrobium nobile types are, in my book, hard as nails. They will tolerate adverse conditions. I mean, they are supposed to have a winter rest. They'll bloom without it. In my experience, they just bloom in the spring. They just do it. But again, they can grow into quite large plants. Whoops, knocking stuff around here. I mean, you know, this plant is nearly 2 foot tall. Well, emphasis on the tall. They do tend to grow skywards, but occasionally you'll get canes sticking out sideways, and then they can start taking up a lot of space. The Dendrobium Phalaenopsis types, they're pretty easygoing. They're not bad, and they come in lots of colours. And they can get quite big, some of them, but some of them stay smaller. But again, you know, they can have multicoloured attractive blooms from the whites, you know, right through all the pinks and the purples and into reds. I think there's yellow ones, although they're not very common. So, you know, multicoloured. Same with the nobiles, multicoloured and patterned, all sorts of, you know, shapes and sizes. And both of those Dendrobium types are pretty easygoing. They will tolerate not quite light levels, although with the nobiles, if they don't get some good light through the winter, they are not likely to bloom as well. They do need that increase in light in the winter, and preferably a bit of a chill, you know, cooler room, cool bright room for the winter, and they'll bloom. And that's not exactly special, you know, if you see what I mean. But if you're going to keep them in your lounge, which is your warmest place in the house because it's where you live, and you haven't got good light, then your nobly hybrids might not bloom very well. So, you know, you move away from that comfort zone. Oncidiums and intergenerics are variable. Some are not so easy as others. Again, some of them are grow like weeds and are as hard as nails, and you've got a job to disrupt them. But the difficult thing with those in the mass-produced market, which is where most of them are going to be bought, is when you buy them, they're often on their way out. They may have pretty blooms on them, but the plant and the root system is not so good. And that's something that's not so easy to spot. It's just the way they're grown. They're not repotted properly when they're potted on, so the original media tends to stay there and rot and take the central root system down. If it's been lucky enough to produce some new roots around the outside of the pot, it's probably still got enough roots to do reasonably well. But you often find you'll get something like a Nellie Isla, which is probably up the more difficult end of the Oncidium types. But the only difficult thing is really it likes to stay cool. You know, it doesn't like hot, warm air, dry air, I mean. But half the time you buy the plant, it's got a couple of bloom spikes on, it looks absolutely good, the leaves don't look bad, and you get it home and you think, I don't like the look of that media really, I think I ought to repot it. And then your troubles start. You take it out of the old media and there's hardly any roots, you know. And then you've got a big plant, possibly still in flower or not long finished flowering. It's used up all its energy and it's got hardly any roots. It may not survive. That's not your fault. Indirectly, that's the mass producer's fault of getting a plant to the point of sale that's not in good condition, because it's going downhill. It's losing its roots already because the media's rubbish. But they don't want to pay for better media to keep the plant alive. All they want is for the thing to bloom and you to buy it. They have no interest in whether it's going to survive through into the next month or the month after. All they want you to do is buy it while it's in bloom, and then it's off their books. That's all they're interested in. What else have I got in here? Some of the Bulbophyllums aren't too difficult to grow. And again, some of those are more tolerant than others. There's some good hybrids. The classic one is this potful down here. That's Elizabeth Ann Buckleberry. It is a bit of a creeper. The rhizomes have got a gap between each pseudobulb, so they do tend to creep across the pot. But not as bad as others. This is a Bulbophyllum, this is Wilbur-Chank. This is a tight rhizome. The pseudobulbs are almost touching. So, although it will spread out, and this does have quite large leaves, it doesn't spread out too quickly. So that's a nice one. Whereas this one, it's not a very good plant. The gaps between the pseudobulbs are 2 to 3 inches long. So it creeps across the pot and gets out of the pot, tries to escape. What else have we got? Some of the Encyclias, they're not too bad, but you're just probably not going to find those in the mass-produced market, your supermarkets and garden centres and stuff. The Epidendrum radicans type often turn up, and those reed-stemmed Epidendrum. A lot of these are just grown in people's gardens in suitable environments, and they grow like flipping weeds into an enormous bush. But they do turn up now and again. They're not difficult, but they are a higher light plant. Where they can be grown outdoors due to the temperature ranges that are suitable, they're often grown in full sun, and they'll do okay. You might get an odd yellow leaf now and again if it's too hot and sunny, but they'll manage it. Vandas are not difficult, but they take up some room. There are some miniature Vandas, some smaller varieties, some of which are more tolerant to changes in temperature, but you'd have to do your homework to find out. And the trouble is, there are so many hybrids on the market that have got no history. It's difficult to find out what went into them, to get back to the species to find out, if you see what I mean. That really applies to an awful lot of hybrids in many orchid types. Trying to find their origins is damn near impossible. And a lot of it is because the person who produced the cross that then cloned them and got a nice little set to sell on at a good profit doesn't want anybody else to know what went into the cross. So they make up a name and they don't register it. So they're the only ones that know. So you can't recreate it. You know, it's like dominating the market with something special, if you get something special. Yeah, so some of the Oncidiums can be difficult, but if you can get one that starts with a good root system and you can maintain that root system, they're not difficult. And as I said, it's not really the orchid that's difficult, it's trying to keep the environment right for them. Quite a few of the Paphiopedilums are relatively tolerant. They don't need high light, they don't need high temperatures, they don't like to get too cold, but they'll put up with a, you know, a cooler room, shall we say. They're not bad, but they're another plant where it's what's in the pot that's important. And you know, if the media starts to break down on the old paths and you start getting root loss, trying to recreate a root system on those is not as easy as some of the other orchids. But if you've got one with good roots and you keep that good root system, they will grow and they will bloom. They're not too bad. A lot of people would say, oh, Masdevallias are no good for beginners. They're incredibly easy to grow if they're grown in the right place. It's all down to where, yeah, rather than the actual orchid itself. If you've got a cool room with medium light levels and you can keep the humidity up by artificial means, you can grow Masdevallias in your home. It really is getting them in the right place. It's not getting the right orchid, it's putting the orchid in the right place. And obviously, again, I always turn that on its head and say, right, what places have I got and what would be suitable for those places? And then put those orchids in those places. And then they've got the best opportunity to thrive. So, bottom line, in my book, there is no such thing as a difficult orchid, but what there is difficulty in recreating suitable environments for them to grow in. That's the difficult bit. And that's the bit that with a little bit of thought and a little bit of work can be overcome. And then you can grow a bigger variety of orchids. And the next word of warning is, of course, if you're starting out and you're thinking of getting a few more orchids, don't go mad. You can reach an overload point where you've got too many to look after because of your lifestyle. So you need to think about how much time can I put in here? You know, and certainly if you're going to go for mounted orchids, I mean, I've got a lot. Now, if I didn't have the time to work with those, they would not do as well as they do, because they do need watering incredibly frequently. And there's quite a few of these are going to have the proper winter rest as well. Yeah, so you know, there's an effort required on my part. The orchids aren't difficult, but by choosing to mount them, excuse me, I believe I've given their roots a better environment to grow in, and certainly with the resting types it allows me to rest them because they're not in anything that can stay wet any length of time. Even in the winter with the short days and the low temperatures, they dry in a day, 2 days max. So if I'm keeping them pretty dry throughout the winter, and I come to the point where they're starting to look like they need a little drinkies, I can give them a little drink. That's not so easy to do in a pot. It's either wet or it's not. Whereas with a mount, well, the ones I'd like to show are the ones hung up and I can't get out. Oh, this will do. It's not a Dendrobium, but it'll do. See, there's a minimal amount of moss on that mount. Now, to water that this time of year, that would get absolutely soaked. Absolutely soaked. The mount, the moss, all the roots, absolutely soaked. If I wanted to keep that drier in the winter, I'd just water some of the roots. I wouldn't water all of them. I'd just like put a trickle on that mass down the bottom and keep them out dry. Or just go round the edges. Yeah, I would have those choices of not absolutely soaking the plant, but still allowing it to have a little drinky poos. And so maintaining that sort of concept of rest. And don't underestimate knowledge. The more you know about the types of orchids you've got, the chances are the better you're going to look after them. But don't treat that as a barrier. Oh, all these people know so much, they're going to grow much better than me. You can have all the knowledge in the world and your plant still dies. Trust me. So, oh, and I always forget the humble Tolumnias, if you can get hold of them, because some places don't seem to sell these. But, I mean, they used to be Oncidiums until they were reclassified. And I understand in this particular case, I have no problems with that reclassifications, because these do not look like Oncidiums. From a distance they do, until you look at the leaves. And they're succulent, fleshy, chunky leaves, as opposed to thin wispy ones. Yeah, but these aren't difficult to grow. They do like pretty good light, and they don't like hot dry air. They're quite temperature tolerant, although they don't like to get cold. But the most important thing I've found with these is don't bury the roots. Keep air around those roots so that after you've watered it, it's going to dry quickly. What you plant them in or on doesn't matter that much. What's important is the ability for them to dry fast. Tiny little terracotta pots with the plant just poked inside is brilliant. The roots will just attach to that, and the pot will be its media. And then you just water the pot and the roots, and it'll dry. You know, things like lava rock, ideal. Charcoal, I suppose. I've seen people growing in charcoal. That seems to work okay. It needs to be the right sort, not the stuff you set fire to on your barbecue. It's got to be pure, no added chemicals and stuff. No paraffin, so that it lights easier. So get proper horticultural charcoal, and make sure you wash it. It's as dusty as hell. But yeah, these can grow in little mesh baskets with no media, or just a couple of chunks of summit for them to get hold of. But these are very easy-going plants, providing you can do that wet-dry cycle quickly. You keep those roots soggy, they will rot. They just don't like it. Now, in theory, like many other things, a Tolumnia may adapt to the old water culture. I can't dismiss water culture on the grounds that it can work for some people and it can make life incredibly easy. Some plants adapt to it pretty quickly, and some don't, and some never do. But it can vary even amongst the same genus. I've seen people growing some Cattleyas in water culture. Well, you have to call it semi-water culture, because they're in a glass, you know, all the roots in a glass, and the glass gets filled up with water, left to soak for a bit of feed now and again perhaps, and then the glass is emptied so that the roots can dry. That'll work. You know, if you think about what you're doing there, that's no different to growing a Cattleya on a tree. You know, it rains, the roots get wet, and then it dries. And that's the important thing. It gets wet and it gets dry. And the gap between those two things is not too long. Otherwise you've got what would be called soggy roots. And not many orchids will put up with that. That's the difference really, I suppose. It's one of the main differences is what orchids come into a wet-dry cycle category and which ones don't. And out of those that don't, are these the constantly moist type, that any sign of dryness and they really don't like it at all, or the ones that can be allowed to get almost dry before you water them again, which is like a nearly wet-dry cycle but not quite. Yeah, I mean, my Oncidiums are allowed to get almost dry before I water them, and in the winter they do get dry and then they get watered. My Masdevallias and Restrepias, I try not to ever let them dry off completely. But in the winter they might go dry for a day or two. Yeah, but the time they realise they haven't quite got enough water, they'll get watered again, because the days are so short, they're not doing much. So they're not in desperate need of hydration, because they're not growing very quickly, if at all. So there we go, a chat about different types of orchids and some of their quirks. Oh, I've got a dry throat today, more coffee. But don't be frightened of venturing out. If you've only ever had half a dozen Phalaenopsis, well, you know, next time you see a nice Dendrobium Phalaenopsis type in a shop that looks like a nice healthy plant, and the base of the plant looks like it's got some nice white roots coming out of the base, heading off into something unknown probably, you know, that's worth a go. And the chances are, wherever you're growing your Phalaenopsis, the Dendrobium Phalaenopsis will grow there as well. They don't need high light. Some Dendrobiums do, but they don't. You know, they don't like to get cold. So, you know, most homes don't get cold, what in orchid terminology is cold. I mean, if you're sat watching your telly and it's only 15 degrees C in your lounge, you'll say it's cold. But most orchids will be okay. I mean, I go down to 12 degrees C in the winter in here, and for some of my orchids that is a bit nippy, yeah. But they put up with it. They don't get a choice. They put up with it or they don't make it. Well, those are the choices. Put up with it or go down. You know, please yourselves. But it doesn't stop me trying new things. I mean, my latest thing is Draculas. The spike's pushing on a little bit, very slowly, but it does seem to be growing. So I've got a few Draculas now. First time this year. So it's a new genus for me. Now, if you go back far enough, they were called Masdevallias once upon a time until they were separated out. Yeah? And quite honestly, they are not much different. If you can grow Masdevallias, you can grow Draculas. The only downside with Draculas is an awful lot of them push their flower spikes out like that, out of the base of the pot. Yeah? So you can't put them in a solid pot or you'll never see any blooms. Yeah? They've got to be in an open space where the flower spikes can escape as they grow downwards. They sometimes come straight out the bottom of the pot, so you have to make allowances for that. Whereas the Masdevallias don't do that. They push their spikes up in with the leaves. Some arch out. But yeah, don't be frightened of trying a few different things. And if you only ever had Phalaenopsis, Dendrobium Phalaenopsis, the nobly type hybrids out of the Dendrobiums, even the Latoria types, they do like a little bit more humidity. They're not as tolerant of dry air, that's for sure. But some of those don't do bad. They don't like to get cold. They don't like high light levels. Yeah? So again, you might be able to slot a couple of those in, and then you will have an a talking point when friends have a look at your orchids. You know, they look round at the Phalaenopsis and think, oh yeah, they got them in Tesco's. And then they see your Latoria blooms and they'll go, what on earth is that? Oh, that's gorgeous. Trust me. Anyway, that's enough of me rambling. This has probably gone on far too long as usual. And the next video that I'll post tomorrow will be part 2 of looking at the mounted orchids. And it's the big stuff in that one mainly. So it's looking at how well or not they've done this year, looking at the canes and stuff like that. So that one's ready to go. Would have been posted today, but I didn't want to break the little tradition I've started with a Sunday morning waffle. So that one will go up tomorrow morning, I expect. And see you next time. Thanks for dropping by.